Hello. This week we are talking about anti-Semitism, and the example for discussing this ideology, which you might associate with Al-Qaeda, Nazi Germany, the present-day government of Hungary, if you're following European politics at all, or Poland. We're discussing it with the example of an American who is famous, Henry Ford. That is the same Ford who is the founder of Ford Motor Company. And if you know more than just the entrepreneurial hagiography of the man, you might be aware that he was a big fan and personal friend of the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler. And the German Ford factories that were built in the 1920s continued to crank out war material for the German army all the way through the end of World War II, while at the same time the US government had to force Ford, just short of basically forcing him at gunpoint, to make war materials in his factories in Detroit. And that is one of the reasons why he is so vehemently opposed to government regulation, interference, etc. And he also blames the Jews for this meddling of the government in his business. Part of the reason of that is that some of the people who were brought in by the government during World War I to make sure that the war machinery worked, and that wasn't a given because, for instance, the railroad industry collapsed under the demand to haul war supplies to the ports and then on to Europe. The railroad industry had to be nationalized. There needed to be a government takeover for a year and a half simply to sort out the mess that the private companies had made. So there were hints of state socialism, of state planning, of central planning, as it turns out, always is the case during war. But this is not about libertarianism and a free market ideology, although there are overlaps, and there is plenty in anti-Semitism that speaks to a kind of anti-capitalism that is more concerned with how government manages markets than it is concerned with how people do under a capitalist economy. So it is not by accident that one of the most successful and wealthiest people in the country, Henry Ford, who made his money by manufacturing as opposed to, say, banking, trade, and other services, embraces anti-Semitism as an ideology. It allows him, who is arguably one of the most powerful people on earth, nonetheless to feel like a victim, regardless of facts, truth, evidence, and so forth. So why is it called anti-Semitism? After all, this ideology is concerned with hatred of and exclusion of Jews. And Judaism is a religion, not a race. However, in the mind of the anti-Semite, that isn't actually true. The anti-Semitism emerges in the mid-19th century alongside other things like white supremacy, social Darwinism, racial theory in general, that says that biology determines people to an extent that really all that matters is the biological genetic makeup. So the Jews, who are a distinct group, therefore have to be a distinct race. For the anti-Semite too, the idea is that the way the world is organized, everything, every conflict, every social change, every problem you encounter can be explained in terms of a universal competition or really war between the races. And it's a zero-sum game. One race is on top, therefore the others have to be subjugated. So if the white race is not clearly in charge, somebody is pulling strings because the racist assumes, the biological racist assumes, the supremacy of whites. This is different from anti-Judaism, hatred of Jews on religious grounds. You might have heard that in the Middle Ages, Jews were persecuted and killed in Europe. They were driven out of Germany, Italy, Spain, and other places, and they were welcomed on the eastern periphery of Europe in the Middle Ages, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was pretty religiously diverse and had in the 1300s only recently embraced Christianity, actually. Jews were welcomed when they were driven out of the rest of Europe, as well as later on in the 1500s. During the Spanish Inquisition, the Ottoman Empire, the main state in the Muslim world, welcomed persecuted Spanish Jews with open arms. But this was about religion. Here in Spain, the assumption was when you were driving out the Jews, you want them to convert. And if they do convert to Christianity, you might still suspect them of not truly believing, but you're always going to keep close watch. You're going to make sure they show up in church. And if all else fails, you can make them convert on their deathbed. And actually, you're the one who's going to put them on their deathbed, because you kill them and then you convert them just before, and that way you make sure that they can't backslide after that. So this is the perverse logic of the Inquisition. Certainly, if you're a victim of that, if you're a target of that persecution, you might find the distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism merely academic. You're just as persecuted, you're just as dead if they come for you. But to understand what kind of ideology we're dealing with, and therefore to do something about it, it's important to make that distinction. So the thinking that comes up in the 19th century in terms of biology simply wasn't available. They didn't know about genes, they didn't know about cells and any of that stuff in the Middle Ages. And they didn't think of people as biological units in the same way as they did in the 19th century, but rather really as spiritual beings. So it is about the salvation of the soul. Another thing is, in the 19th century, an important change had happened, because with the age of revolution in America, in France, eventually in all other places, religion was dropped as a criterion for belonging to the state. In the early modern era, the doctrine was established that you have the religion of your ruler. If your ruler becomes a Protestant, you become a Protestant. If he becomes a Calvinist, so do you. The state and the church is one thing. If you have people who, for some reason or another, because perhaps their town was conquered and they followed a different religion before, suddenly you get a religious minority, they may get tolerated, which is toleration means you're allowed to continue to do what you're doing, believe what you may. However, the state is clear on the point that you're wrong. You're just not going to get killed or force converted, but you have to pay a fee, for instance, a special tax, a protection fee, so to speak, because the state itself is homogeneous, religiously homogeneous. Once again, for contrast with the Muslim world, there, the different non-Muslim religious groups had self-governance. So Jews and Christians in the Muslim world had their own courts, followed their own law, except for when they had disputes involving members of other religions. Then the laws of the empire applied. And this follows the Roman Empire model, by the way. So this ends in 1776 with the American Revolution, and especially in 1789 with the French Revolution. From that point onward, there is just citizenship. Anybody living in the state belongs to the state, is part of the sovereign state people, and there is no more distinction based on birth, like nobility or being a peasant or whatever. No more distinction in the rights a person has because of their race, of their regional background, of their language, of their culture, or of their religion. There is just citizens, each and every one just as much entitled to the same rights as every other one. So many people started then to argue, but how are the Jews going to be able to be equal to us? Because they are so different. This does not make sense. Liberals tried to explain, that people who were in favor of constitutional government and equal rights tried to explain that if you really believe in equality, then you have to assume there is something that unites people beyond the things that divide them. And of course, yes, religion divides people. But it's just the same as with people who have different amounts of property or who live in different regions with different local traditions. There is no reasonable way to say that Jews are fundamentally different because of their religion from every Christian, whereas all Christians are fundamentally equal. The division between Protestants and Catholics alone in Germany, which came, and actually all over Europe, which came with 200 to 300 years of religious warfare within Christianity, should be proven up. So this is one issue where Jews are targeted for exclusion or to deny them full inclusion with rights as voters, as people who can get jobs with the government, who can become members of parliament and so forth. But it is one step further to say that actually you can't have equality, you can't have citizenship, because a particular group of people is so different by their biological makeup that they can never join. So the two venues for strangers to join and become one of us that used to be available even to Jews: one, you convert to Christianity; two, you become a member of the state. Religious and political integration are denied if you're saying that these people are inherently different, they can never become like us because it's in their biology, it's in their blood. So this is first the way that the anti-Semite imagines Jews as an alien race that is almost like a different species from the rest of humanity. And then comes the ascription that this is a bad thing and that this is a dangerous thing. The ascription to Jews of all kinds of misdeeds, bad intentions, trickery, fraud, deceit, and so forth. So not only, therefore, the anti-Semite said, Jews can never become part of us, but the fact that they live among us is dangerous, and we have to get rid of them. To the extent that they have rights, we have to take those rights away, because they're going to abuse them to do something that is harmful to us. And therefore, we must not allow them to move amongst us and participate in civil and political life as equals. And if this sounds familiar, if this sounds like the rhetoric about Muslims that is coming from the Republican Party today, then that is because it's the same line of tradition. And it has it is sort of a structural anti-Semitism. It follows the same pattern of thought. The anti-Muslim hysteria follows the same pattern of thought that anti-Semitism does. However, where anti-Semitism stands on its own, among all the different ideologies of race and religion that strive to exclude people, is that Jews are also blamed for what's wrong with capitalism. They are seen as perpetrators of whatever you find objectionable with capitalism. And for the anti-Semite, usually there is a distinction. You have good capitalism, where people make useful stuff like cars, where people produce tangible things with their hands. That's the good capitalism. And then you have the bad capitalism, which is where people count money, where they deal with paper and contracts and sophistication, and they have lawyers involved, and it doesn't involve the manual labor. It is further removed from the concrete, and it's moving entirely in the abstract. So the hope is, the anti-Semitic economic theory hopes that if you get rid of the Jews, you'll get rid of all the trickery and fraud that makes capitalism bad. You'll clean up the act of the financial system if only you get rid of the Jews, who are the evildoers that abuse it. There's nothing inherently wrong with capitalism. It is because one group of people exploits it for their purposes. This is, of course, deeply flawed. It doesn't reflect how capitalism works. The financial system, services, and manufacturing are joined at the hip. They need each other. They work together. Whatever is wrong with capitalism is wrong with the whole thing. You can't just cut out one part of it and say the rest is healthy and we'll let that live. The problems it has run through it. And manufacturing is, in fact, the base of the entire thing. The reason there is a financial system, and there has to be one, is because of mass market commodity production, of mass manufacturing. Anyway, but if you have an ideology that tells you this is how the world works, my ideology can explain everything, and then it turns out you're in power, you act on that assumption, like the Nazi government in Germany, and yet the world still is not whole. You haven't fixed it, even though you're doing everything to get rid of the evildoers. What is the conclusion from that? That you may have been wrong about your analysis, about your worldview of how the world works? No, of course not. What is wrong is that it's another trick of the Jews that are still out there somewhere, in the deep state perhaps. They are pulling strings, or in the media, they're confusing people. That is how deep the conspiracy goes. This is how dangerous the Jews are. You kill them all, you fight them, you lock them up, and they're still controlling everything. So the anti-Semite has a commitment to a particular worldview that nothing, and absolutely nothing, in the realm of experience, facts, truth, etc., can change. It is an ideology that is designed to insulate itself against any kind of insight into its foundations, which makes it pretty nefarious. Now, if you're looking at the worksheet, and if you're reading it and you're thinking about answers, this text, Ford's writing here, is in the same ballpark as Carnegie, where you might ask yourself, can he really be saying this? Is that really what he's saying? And usually, yes, he is saying that. Or you might also look for logical consistency. You might think to yourself, but he just said this. Why he can't be saying that now, because that does not make sense. Don't expect it to make sense. Try to figure out what he's saying. And keep in mind that it may well not make sense, that it may be contradictory in itself, that it may be very far from the truth. Because if you find that it is contradictory and that it has a very loose connection to the truth, if any, then you are looking at what defines anti-Semitism. So with these words, I am looking forward to a productive discussion this week and hope you're enjoying the reading and you're doing well on your quizzes.